Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 93, Shenanigans at Sea. Last time, we introduced the Scipio brothers properly to the war they were fighting in. Let's now continue the war and see how this pans out for Antiochus III. Our Seleucid monarch spent the winter of 191 into 190 BCE preparing. In particular, he focused on getting his fleet ready so that he wouldn't have lost control of the waves. He was worried that, in the last naval conflict, the island of Rhodes hadn't even been involved. After all, they wouldn't show up late the second time round. He therefore ordered Hannibal to go into Syria and get ships from Phoenicia. He also summoned his allies together from his base in Phrygia, even summoning the Gauls from Galatia. It's at this point that we get a rare mention of one of the king's sons. His second-born son Seleucus, now the eldest son surviving and heir to the throne with the death of his brother Antiochus the young king, had been left behind in Aeolis with a military force. His goal was to hold the settlements of the Aeolian Greek coast. However, this was difficult as both Eumenes II of Pergamon and the Romans were trying to get them to rebel and slip away. During the middle of winter, Eumenes II arrived at the Roman naval headquarters with 2,000 foot soldiers and 500 cavalry. He also convinced the Romans to do some raiding in a specific profitable region called Thyatira. At the same time, the city of Phocaea, which had been smarting under Roman rule, rebelled and declared for Antiochus III. The Romans handled this by withdrawing their fleets from it. Now, the nobility of Phocaea wanted to stick with the Romans, while the populace no longer had the fear of direct rule incentivizing them. We'll come back to Phocaea in a moment, but all I'll say for now is, keep your mental eye on it. Let's now transition over to the naval state of affairs. When the spring of 190 BCE arrived, Rhodes sent their fleet more promptly than last year, as per Antiochus' fears. Meanwhile, we cut over to Polyxenides, who was himself exiled from the island of Rhodes. The Seleucid commander found out that the Rhodian fleet had left, and that the Rhodian commander had insulted Polyxenides in a speech. He thus made his own speech specifically attacking the Rhodes commander, and began scheming pretty much constantly on how to bring about his rival's downfall. All of this strikes me, as an outsider, as brilliantly petty, but hey, who am I to judge? Honor systems must have been different back in the day. Polyxenides essentially pretended to defect to the Rhodian cause. He pretended he would give up all or most of the Seleucid fleet in return for being allowed to go home to the island of Rhodes. The Rhodian commander, a man called Pausistratus, was initially skeptical, but ultimately fell for it. Polyxenides pretended to leave his fleet in a shabby condition. In his excitement to take control of it, the Rhodian commander began diverting some ships to various tasks and leaving some ready to spring into action if need be. Essentially, he was acting sloppy and careless because of information he thought he had. All the while, Polyxenides was not bringing his oarsmen to Ephesus, as he'd been indicating, but instead diverting them to Magnesia. Now, the wording of my sources was a bit vague, but I think this means he's hiding the fact he's actually preparing his fleet by assembling it somewhere else. Polyxenides then unexpectedly gathered his fleet and surrounded the harbour the totally unprepared Rhodians were now in. The Rhodian commander was stunned, but determined the only way out of the blockade he'd stumbled into was to fight his way out. For his trouble, his flagship was sunk, and Pausistratus was killed. However, some ships still managed to limp their way out. Still though, we're going to take it. A victory for the Seleucids is better than nothing in recent times, and Bevan does call it a noteworthy victory. Now, these ships that limped out of the blockade found some others who had originally been coming to reinforce the Rhodians. Learning of what had happened, the whole lot turned round to join the Romans instead. Let's swing back to the city of Phocaea for a moment, which had been contemplating breaking away, but the aristocracy weren't exactly a fan of the idea. Round about now, the city of Phocaea opened its gates to Prince Seleucus, despite the city itself formally declaring he should leave, and he took the town. This is because his mere presence in the region had emboldened the pro-Seleucid faction, hence his success. Now, it's worth noting that Phocaea had importance to Rome because of how close it was to the important city of Magnesia on Sipylus in Anatolia. A city called Cyme, or possibly Cyme, C-Y-M-E, also changed sides and joined Prince Seleucus because they were afraid of him. Now, you might be thinking, what exactly are the Romans doing during all of this? Well, all this time, Livius had been besieging a town called Abydos, which was about to surrender and, in fact, negotiating terms with him. However, when he learnt of the disaster that had befallen the Rhodians, he abruptly withdrew. His worry was that Polyxenides would capitalize on his naval success, and would attack the Roman fleet while it was still in winter quarters. So, Livius withdrew from his watchful gaze of the Hellespont and ordered his fleet to set sail. Livius, and incidentally Eumenes II of Pergamon, set sail for the island of Samos. However, Polyxenides had expected this. He arrived at an island on the way to Samos and found out that the Romans had been thrown into chaos by a storm at sea. So, he lay in wait, ready to pounce on the Romans as they made their way towards the island of Samos itself. However, the element of surprise was somewhat ruined, as the Roman ships managed to make it to a port on the island and found out from peasants that the Seleucid fleets were waiting for them. They elected, instead of fighting, to wait for reinforcements from Rhodes and instead headed back to Corycus. His plans thwarted, Polyxenides returned back to Ephesus. The Rhodian contingent now met up with the Roman commander Regulus. They decided to head to Asia once they found out the problems the original Rhodian fleet had suffered. There, they linked up with Livius, who, remember, had been delegating the fleet's actions rather than being there in person. So, the Roman fleet setting sail to Samos hadn't had Livius with them, hence why he's able to meet up with these Rhodians now. Regulus now took over running the fleet from Livius, and suggested they sail for Ephesus and sink ships loaded with ballast in the harbour. That way, they could stop Antiochus from launching his own ships, and essentially give themselves control of the sea. This suggestion of bottling Antiochus in by sinking part of their own fleet was met with flat-out rejection. Eumenes II of Pergamon asked the very sensible question of what would happen after they sank these ships. There would be questions such as whether the whole fleet should then keep blockading, or if they were allowed to go and help elsewhere. The Romans would have to be guards of the Seleucid fleet pretty much constantly, and would be vulnerable to whatever nature threw at them. In the end, it was decided they would attack Ephesus. However, the campaign ultimately stalled due to bad weather. In the meantime, let's cut back over to Prince Seleucus. He had kept his army in Aeolis during the winter, raiding his enemies and trying to coax allies over. Prince Seleucus now wanted to invade Pergamon. Now, this was a grand Seleucid invasion of Pergamon. Seleucus' father Antiochus III also left his base at Apamea and set up camp at Sardis with an army including 4,000 Gauls. His ancestor Antiochus I, I can't help but think, might have had some choice words about their inclusion in his army. The Gauls were tasked with raiding around the city of Pergamon, with Antiochus himself wanting to crush this Anatolian kingdom. Now, Eumenes II's brother Attalus had been left in charge of domestic affairs while Eumenes was away. That said, once the Seleucids showed up, all he could really do was bunker down in the capital, leaving the countryside to be attacked by Seleucid forces. For those wondering, or reading ahead, yes, this Attalus is the future King Attalus II of Pergamon, the second son of Attalus I. However, he won't be king for a few decades yet. Word reached the current king of Pergamon, Eumenes II, that his capital was under threat. He rushed back to the city of Elea, and the Romans did the same. Antiochus received this news. At the same time, he also received the news that there was a consular army in Macedon waiting to cross over into Asia to fight him. So he tried opening peace talks with the coalition against him. However, although Rhodes was not necessarily against peace, Eumenes II of Pergamon was now a full-on warhawk, as you might expect from the fact that his capital was being besieged. In the end, Antiochus III just received the non-committal reply that they needed to wait for Consul Scipio to arrive to decide anything about peace. Remember, the Scipio brothers, as we covered last time, are currently in Greece. Now, Antiochus III did not have time for a lengthy siege of either Pergamon or Elea, where Eumenes II was currently holed up. So, Antiochus simply decided to raid the country around them. He then left Prince Seleucus in charge and plundered the rich plain of Thebes. Now, some Achaean reinforcements for Pergamon arrived at Elea and travelled to Pergamon to reinforce Attalus. They noticed that, because the Achaean forces were not actively attacking, the Seleucid army that had been left behind under Prince Seleucus was not particularly on its guard. So, these reinforcements launched themselves at an enemy outpost. This attack was deemed to be risky by their commander and ludicrous by the townspeople, as this relief force was outnumbered by about 4 to 1. And if we're just looking at cavalry numbers, the disparity with the Seleucids here was about 6 to 1. However, the reinforcements just stood in front of the Seleucids for a while the Seleucid forces started drifting apart. Once they did, these reinforcements rushed forwards and caused havoc among the Seleucid ranks. They then went back into the city. The next day, they did this same kind of dance all over again, and ultimately this all caused Seleucus to have to withdraw from Pergamon. His father must have been delighted. For his own part, Antiochus III steered clear of cities the Romans were protecting. He took some cities and then travelled back to Sardis. After having been evicted from Pergamon, Seleucus stayed on the coast, either causing terror or submission. The Romans tried to take an island called Bacchium, but Seleucid reinforcements saw them off. The Seleucids then faced off against the Rhodians in a sea battle. It's worth noting that Hannibal, maybe among his Phoenician ships I'm not sure, was in this battle, as part of the right wing. Now, you might be thinking that the presence of the legendary general Hannibal might mean something good is going to happen for the Seleucids. But no, the end result of this confrontation was a rout of the Seleucid forces. In point of fact, the Roman forces chased them right up until they were worried of beaching themselves because of how close to land they were getting. So, not exactly the success story Hannibal's presence might otherwise have implied. Cut back to Antiochus. He had been steering clear of the cities the Romans were protecting, taking some cities and then travelling back to Sardis. He was getting more soldiers from nearby territories, as well as writing to Prusias of Bithynia that the Romans were attempting to conquer all kings, in order to get Prusias on side. In fact, Prusias almost joined Antiochus, but a letter written by Consul Scipio put him off. Now, it's worth noting that our Roman source Livy writes this as if Prusias was fooled by Antiochus and the Romans simply enlightened him, but I can well imagine that the text of the letter Scipio wrote was just a skull and crossbones with "you know what we mean" written at the bottom. So, with this diplomatic mission a failure, Antiochus gave up and left for Ephesus to get his fleets ready. Now, as we've covered before, he was focusing on his fleets, despite what his many land engagements up until now might have told you. This is because he knew he could not face down the combined might of both the Scipio brothers on land. This was also a good moment for him to focus on his fleets. The Rhodians were not in the region, while Eumenes had taken his ships to go and meet the Scipios over in Europe. The fact that a Rhodian fleet had also been broken at Samos thanks to a trick also helped his spirits. So, Antiochus III sent Polyxenides out to go and try to get into a fight. He himself travelled on to a town called Notium to try and seize it. That's where we'll leave it for today. We will continue the war against the Scipios next time. Until then, thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch at the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.